take a seat in the back. This meeting is for leadership." Those were the first words my boss said to me that morning, loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. For a moment, no one moved. A few people glanced at me, then quickly looked down at their laptops as if they suddenly found their spreadsheets fascinating. I simply nodded, picked up my notebook, and walked toward the empty chair near the door. It was the kind of chair people used when they weren't really part of the meeting, the kind placed close enough to listen but far enough away to be forgotten. The conference room on the 32nd floor overlooked most of downtown Chicago, the late morning sun reflecting off rows of glass buildings and turning the long table into a mirror of polished oak and expensive suits. 12 executives sat around that table, most of them younger than my son would have been, tapping on tablets and whispering to one another about quarterly projections and expansion numbers. My boss, Daniel Carter, stood confidently at the front beside a giant presentation screen, adjusting his cufflinks like a man preparing for applause. Daniel had a way of filling a room, not with warmth, but with the quiet pressure of someone who expected obedience. He glanced once toward the back where I had taken my seat, his expression satisfied, as though placing me there had restored the proper order of things. No one questioned it. No one asked why a 67-year-old woman who had been invited to a high-level strategy meeting was sitting beside the coffee station like an assistant waiting to refill cups. I rested my notebook on my lap and studied the room instead. Years of consulting had taught me that people reveal more when they think you don't matter. The chief financial officer leaned toward the head of marketing and whispered something that made them both smirk. The operations director flipped through printed documents with a slight frown, clearly seeing numbers he didn't fully trust. Daniel, meanwhile, clicked the remote in his hand, and the first slide of his presentation appeared on the screen behind him. "Today," he announced confidently, "I'm going to walk you through a strategy that will transform our company's expansion over the next 5 years." I tilted my head slightly as the slide changed. The title alone felt strangely familiar. When the next slide appeared, showing a detailed growth model and market entry plan, the room filled with quiet admiration. A few executives nodded. One of them even murmured, "Impressive." I kept my expression neutral, but inside I felt a slow, almost amused realization settle in. I had seen this plan before. In fact, I had written it. 3 weeks earlier, I had spent 4 long evenings at my kitchen table outside Evanston drafting that exact framework as part of a confidential consulting proposal requested by the executive office. The language on the slide was nearly identical to what I remembered typing, right down to the phrasing of the market penetration strategy. Daniel paced slowly across the front of the room, as if presenting the discovery of something revolutionary. "This approach," he continued, gesturing toward the screen, "came from months of research and analysis." A few heads nodded again. From the back of the room, I watched quietly, my hands folded over the notebook on my lap, saying nothing at all. Daniel continued speaking with the smooth confidence of someone who believed the room already belonged to him. Each slide appeared with a quiet click of the remote in his hand, displaying charts, timelines, and projections that drew approving nods from several executives around the table. From where I sat beside the door, I could see the reflection of the screen in the glass wall behind them, the numbers stretching across the skyline of Chicago like another layer of the city itself. I watched Daniel carefully, not with anger, but with the same calm attention I had learned after 4 decades of consulting. People often revealed their weaknesses when they tried too hard to appear certain. He moved quickly through the financial projections, pointing at colored graphs that showed impressive growth over the next 5 years. "If we enter the Midwestern secondary markets first," he explained, tapping the screen, "we create a foundation that supports national expansion." The chief financial officer leaned forward slightly, folding his hands together. "That is an aggressive timeline," he said, his voice measured. Daniel smiled the way a man smiles when he believes he has already won the argument. "Aggressive, yes," he replied, "but achievable with the right leadership." A few quiet chuckles circled the table. Someone near the center scribbled a note. I lowered my eyes to my notebook for a moment, tracing the edge of the paper with my pen. The timeline on that slide had taken me 3 hours to calculate because the market data had to be adjusted for regional growth patterns. Daniel was presenting it now, as if it had come to him during a casual afternoon brainstorming session. Another slide appeared. This one outlined a partnership strategy with smaller regional firms. One of the executives frowned slightly. "How do you plan to secure those partnerships so quickly?" she asked. Daniel paused just long enough to create the impression that he was considering the question deeply. "Relationships," he said confidently. "I've been cultivating them for some time." I almost smiled at that. The partnerships he was referring to had come from a list of contacts I had built over 25 years working with companies across the Midwest. Several of those executives had once sat across from me in rooms very much like this one, discussing growth strategies and expansion models while drinking the same lukewarm conference room coffee that now sat untouched beside my chair. Daniel moved into the final section of the presentation, the part that explained how the entire plan would be implemented within the company. "With a proper structure," he continued, gesturing broadly, "this strategy positions us ahead of every competitor in our sector." The room grew quieter as the last slide appeared. It displayed a bold headline across the top of the screen: 5-Year Expansion Initiative. Underneath it were 3 bullet points summarizing the entire strategy. The same 3 bullet points I remember typing late one evening at my kitchen table while a soft rain tapped against the windows outside. Daniel stepped back from the screen and looked around the table with the satisfied expression of a man expecting applause. Several executives nodded again. One even murmured that the plan was impressive. From the back of the room, I closed my notebook slowly and rested it on my lap. The meeting had not yet reached its most interesting moment. Experience had taught me that the truth often arrived quietly, sometimes through a door that opened when no one expected it. The room remained quiet after Daniel finished speaking, the kind of quiet that usually followed a presentation people wanted to appear impressed by. A few executives leaned back in their chairs, exchanging small glances that suggested they were still evaluating what they had just heard. Daniel stood confidently near the screen, folding his hands in front of him as if he had already secured their approval. "This initiative," he continued, "places us in a position where we will not simply compete with the market leaders. We will redefine the market entirely." The chief financial officer nodded slowly, though the slight crease in his forehead had not disappeared. "And the capital allocation?" he asked. "The early expansion phase will require significant resources." Daniel gestured toward the final slide again. "The capital requirements are built into the model. Once the first 3 markets stabilize, the growth curve supports itself." I noticed the operations director tilt his head slightly, studying the numbers more carefully. He flipped through the printed packet in front of him and then glanced back at the screen. "These projections assume regional adoption faster than the national average," he said thoughtfully. Daniel did not hesitate. "That is correct," he replied, "because we will be entering underserved markets." From the back of the room, I listened quietly, recognizing the exact point where Daniel was beginning to improvise. The original model accounted for that concern with a phased adjustment that he had not mentioned. Without that adjustment, the timeline would look optimistic, perhaps even unrealistic to someone studying the numbers closely. But Daniel continued speaking as though every detail had been calculated by his own careful research. Around the table, the executives began asking more questions. The head of marketing wanted to know how the company would introduce the new brand presence in smaller cities. The technology director asked about infrastructure costs. Daniel answered each question with the same polished certainty, though occasionally his explanations drifted slightly away from the numbers displayed on the screen. I rested my hands on my notebook and watched the room with calm patience. Years ago, I had learned that meetings like this often moved in quiet stages. First came the presentation. Then came the polite questions. Eventually, someone with enough authority would arrive and shift the entire direction of the conversation. As if responding to that very thought, the sound of the conference room door opening interrupted the discussion. It was not a dramatic entrance. The door simply swung inward with a soft click of the handle. Several executives turned their heads at the same time. The conversation stopped mid-sentence. Daniel froze for a fraction of a second beside the screen. Standing in the doorway was Robert Langford, the chief executive officer of the company. He rarely attended strategy meetings personally. His schedule usually placed him 3 cities away or inside a boardroom with investors. The fact that he had appeared here without announcement caused a subtle ripple through the room. Chairs shifted slightly as everyone straightened in their seats. Robert stepped inside calmly, carrying nothing but a slim leather folder in one hand. He offered a polite nod to the executives gathered around the table. "Please continue," he said in a relaxed voice. Daniel cleared his throat and attempted to resume his explanation, though the rhythm of the room had changed. Robert did not take the empty chair at the head of the table. Instead, he remained standing for a moment, scanning the room with the quiet attentiveness of someone who understood every detail happening in it. His gaze moved across the executives, past the presentation screen, and then toward the far end of the conference room where the extra chairs had been placed near the door. For a brief moment, his eyes rested on me. Robert Langford did not say anything at first. He simply stood there near the doorway for a moment, studying the room with a calm expression that made several people suddenly very aware of their posture. It was remarkable how quickly the atmosphere shifted when the person with the highest authority entered without warning. Daniel adjusted the sleeve of his jacket and forced a confident smile. "Mr. Langford," he said, his voice carrying a slightly sharper edge than before, "we were just reviewing our 5-year expansion strategy." Robert nodded politely, though he did not immediately move toward the head of the table. Instead, he took a few slow steps forward, his attention still scanning the room in quiet observation. "Please continue," he said again, his tone relaxed but attentive. Daniel cleared his throat and turned slightly back toward the screen as if to regain control of the moment. The slide behind him still displayed the final summary of the expansion initiative, the 3 bullet points glowing against the polished screen. "As I was explaining," Daniel continued, "this strategy allows us to enter 3 key markets within the first 18 months while maintaining stable capital flow." Several executives nodded again, though their attention now drifted between Daniel and the man standing a few feet away from the conference table. Robert did not interrupt. Instead, he began walking slowly along the side of the room, passing behind the row of executives seated near the windows. His pace was unhurried, the kind of calm movement that made people feel they were being carefully evaluated without a single word spoken. I watched him approach from the back of the room, his reflection appearing briefly in the glass wall beside the skyline outside. Daniel continued explaining the rollout schedule, though his sentences had become slightly longer, slightly more complicated, as if he were trying to sound even more authoritative now that the chief executive officer was listening. "The operational framework," he said, gesturing toward the slide, "ensures that each market launch supports the next stage of expansion." Robert stopped walking for a moment near the center of the room, listening quietly. One of the executives asked another question about regional partnerships, and Daniel answered it quickly, perhaps a little too quickly. I noticed Robert glance toward the presentation screen, and then toward the printed packets resting in front of several executives. The room had grown very still again. Even the soft tapping of keyboards had stopped. Then Robert resumed walking. But instead of moving toward the empty chair at the head of the table, he turned slightly and continued past the executives, moving toward the back of the room where the extra chairs had been placed near the door. Daniel paused mid-sentence as he noticed the movement. Several heads turned at once. Robert walked calmly past the coffee station and stopped beside the chair where I was sitting with my notebook resting on my lap. For a brief moment, he looked down at the open pages of my notes, then back at my face. Water. A few people immediately turned in their seats. Others glanced down at their printed packets, as if checking whether they had missed something important. I closed my notebook gently and looked up at him. "Good morning, Robert," I replied. His smile widened slightly, the kind of expression people show when greeting someone they respect rather than someone they simply recognize. "I did not realize you would be attending today," he said. "I assumed you would be sitting at the table." The room grew noticeably quieter. Daniel cleared his throat from the front of the room. "Margaret is observing," he said quickly, his voice carefully measured. "This is primarily an internal leadership meeting." Robert tilted his head slightly as if considering that explanation. Then he glanced toward the long conference table where the executives were seated, their attention now completely focused on the conversation happening near the door. "Observing," he repeated softly. His eyes returned to me. "Margaret, why are you sitting back here?" The question was simple, but it carried enough weight that no one in the room attempted to answer it for me. I rested my hands on my notebook and offered a small, polite shrug. I was told the leadership seats were reserved, I said calmly. Several executives exchanged uneasy glances. Daniel stepped forward slightly, his smile now more rigid. We did not want to disrupt the structure of the meeting, he explained. Robert remained silent for a moment, studying the room again. Then he turned back toward me and said something that seemed to slow the air in the entire conference room. That is unusual, he said thoughtfully, considering that Margaret helped design the expansion framework we are discussing. A ripple of quiet confusion moved through the executives seated around the table of the empty chair beside me and spoke in the same steady tone. Margaret, he said, I think you should be sitting at the table. For a moment, no one moved. The executives around the long table looked from Robert to me and then toward Daniel, as if waiting for someone to explain what had just happened. I placed my notebook gently on the chair beside me and stood up, smoothing the sleeve of my jacket with the quiet habit of someone who had spent many years walking into rooms like this one. Robert stepped slightly aside to give me space as I moved toward the table. The sound of my footsteps across the polished floor seemed unusually clear in the silence. No one spoke as I approached the empty chair Robert had indicated. The seat was near the center of the table, close enough to the presentation screen that I could now see every detail of the slides Daniel had been showing. I rested my notebook in front of me and sat down calmly. Around the table, several executives adjusted their posture again, their attention now shifting toward me with open curiosity. Robert took the chair beside mine rather than the one at the head of the table, a choice that did not go unnoticed by anyone in the room. Daniel remained standing near the screen, the remote control still in his hand though he had stopped clicking through the slides. Robert folded his hands lightly on the table and glanced at the presentation behind Daniel. This expansion framework, he said thoughtfully, has generated a great deal of interest among our investors. His tone was calm but attentive. Several executives nodded in agreement. Robert then turned slightly toward me. Margaret, perhaps you can walk us through the reasoning behind the first phase of the strategy. Daniel shifted his weight almost immediately. Enter, but because they are overlooked by larger competitors. Several executives leaned forward slightly. I continued in the same steady tone. Those markets already show strong growth patterns, but they lack the infrastructure that major firms usually require before investing. That creates an opportunity if the rollout is structured carefully. Robert nodded once, as if encouraging me to continue. I pointed lightly toward the chart displayed on the screen. The timeline on this slide assumes rapid adoption, which is possible if the company builds partnerships with regional firms already trusted in those communities. The head of marketing glanced down at her packet and then back at me. That explains the partnership model, she said quietly. I nodded. Exactly. Those relationships reduce entry resistance and accelerate brand credibility. Robert's attention remained steady. And the capital structure? He asked. I turned a page in my notebook. The early phase requires moderate investment, but the third market launch must be delayed by 6 months to stabilize the revenue flow. A few executives immediately began checking the numbers in front of them. Robert leaned back slightly in his chair, his expression thoughtful. Daniel remained standing beside the screen, completely silent now as the room began to absorb the difference between a presentation and the person who had originally designed it. The room grew noticeably more focused as the executives studied their packets again, this time with a different kind of attention. When Daniel had spoken earlier, the numbers had sounded impressive. His head a fraction as if weighing that explanation. Then he turned his attention back toward me. Margaret, what would happen if the adjustment were not made? He asked. I said calmly, depends entirely on the stability of the first 2 markets. I pointed lightly toward the screen without raising my voice. If those launches are structured properly, the company does not need to rush into additional regions immediately. Instead, the infrastructure can expand gradually while revenue strengthens. The head of operations nodded slowly, clearly following the logic now that the explanation matched the underlying data. That would also reduce the pressure on logistics, he said. Exactly, I replied. Rapid expansion creates visibility, but controlled expansion creates sustainability. Robert remained silent beside me, listening with the kind of quiet attention that encouraged the rest of the room to do the same. Across the table, the chief financial officer leaned forward again, scanning the projections in the printed packet. If the second phase begins 12 months later instead of 6, he said thoughtfully, the operating margin improves significantly. I nodded once. That adjustment allows the company to build regional leadership instead of temporary presence. A few executives exchanged brief looks of realization. The head of marketing even smiled slightly as she wrote a note on the margin of her packet. That would also strengthen brand loyalty before national competitors respond, she added. Robert finally spoke again, his tone measured but unmistakably satisfied. It seems the framework becomes much clearer when the person who built it explains the structure. The comment was gentle, but the meaning behind it did not escape anyone in the room. Daniel shifted his position near the screen, his earlier confidence replaced by a careful stillness. Robert turned slightly toward him. Daniel, he said politely, the presentation outlines the opportunity well. However, the strategic details appear to be more complex than the slides suggest. Daniel forced a small nod. Of course, he replied. The framework continues to evolve. Robert looked back toward the table and rested one hand lightly on the printed packet in front of him. Margaret, he said calmly, if the company follows the timeline you originally proposed, how long before the expansion begins generating consistent returns? I glanced once more at my notes before answering. Between 18 and 24 months, I said. The early markets will require patience, but once the regional partnerships mature, the growth curve becomes self-sustaining. The room absorbed the explanation quietly. Several executives were already adjusting the numbers in their packets, recalculating the projections based on the revised timeline. Robert watched them for a moment, then looked back at me with a thoughtful expression. That level of stability, he said, is exactly what the board has been asking for. Around the table, the conversation had changed completely. What had begun as a presentation was now becoming a strategy session guided by the person who had quietly designed the entire plan. The room settled into a quiet rhythm of focused discussion as several executives recalculated the projections in their reports. Papers moved softly across the polished surface of the table, and the faint tapping of a pen against a folder echoed for a moment before stopping again. The skyline outside the windows had shifted slightly as the sun climbed higher over the city, casting a brighter reflection across the conference room glass. Robert Langford watched the room with the relaxed patience of someone who had attended hundreds of meetings like this one. After allowing the executives a few moments to review the revised numbers, he folded his hands on the table and spoke in the same calm tone that had guided the entire conversation. It appears the strategy becomes significantly stronger when the operational timing is adjusted, he said. The chief financial officer nodded immediately. Yes, he replied. With the revised structure, the expansion becomes far more stable. The head of operations added quietly, and it reduces logistical pressure during the early launches. Robert glanced once more at the presentation screen and then turned toward Daniel, who still stood beside it with the remote resting loosely in his hand. Daniel, Robert said politely, your presentation has introduced an important initiative. However, the framework itself clearly originated from Margaret's analysis. Daniel managed a small nod. The strategy was developed collaboratively, he answered carefully. Robert acknowledged the statement with a neutral expression, then turned back toward me. Margaret, he said, when we discussed this proposal several weeks ago, you mentioned that the success of the entire expansion would depend on careful leadership during the first 2 phases. I nodded slightly. That is correct. The early decisions will determine whether the company builds sustainable growth or temporary momentum. Robert leaned back in his chair and studied the executives seated around the table. One by one they looked up from their packets, clearly aware that the direction of the meeting had already changed. After a moment, Robert spoke again, this time with quiet clarity. In that case, he said, it would be appropriate for Margaret to guide the implementation of the strategy she designed. The sentence landed gently, yet its meaning filled the room with unmistakable certainty. The chief financial officer nodded in agreement almost immediately. The head of marketing followed with the same quiet approval. Around the table, several executives exchanged brief looks that reflected the same conclusion. Robert then turned slightly toward me. Margaret Hayes, he said, his tone respectful but decisive, I would like you to serve as strategic partner on this expansion initiative and oversee the first phase of its development. For a brief moment, no one spoke. Then I closed my notebook and placed it calmly on the table in front of me. I would be glad to help guide the process, I replied. Robert smiled slightly and rose from his chair. The executives followed his lead, standing almost instinctively as the meeting drew to its natural conclusion. Daniel stepped away from the presentation screen without saying anything further. I gathered my notebook and looked once across the conference room that had seemed so distant only an hour earlier. The same table, the same chairs, the same executives. The only difference now was that everyone in the room clearly understood who had been sitting quietly in the back all along.